I think it's sorted now. Pete's definitely going to have to be taken away by ambulance though, because of the absolute horror that the microphone couldn't find a frequency. Apparently there was a frequency issue, and then Pete couldn't find any frequencies, and then decided the probable explanation was potentially that aliens had taken over the world and this was just the beginning of the end. Fortunately, wasn't the case. But I did think I'd just put a puppy on for the first minute so that you could all be like, oh, I feel my stress levels decreasing with such a cute puppy. It's an excuse for anything. Ignore all the technical issues. It didn't happen. Just concentrate on the puppy. Look at the puppy. It's all fine now. Everything's fine. It didn't happen. Right, let's get back on with it. So I was talking before the interruption about the mental health worker who had lost a resident, and I was saying that one of the things that we do when we're a professional is we often spend our time compartmentalising because we have to, and for the most part it's really effective because you can't deal with all the issues that everybody has that you work with. You can't take them home with you all the time. You do some of them, but for the most part you get good at compartmentalising, and then things happen outside the realm of what should happen. And in this case you're talking about the loss of somebody who had great meaning. And I think that there's two levels to this. So level one is, I think it's really awesome that that resident had such an impact on you, because sometimes when people have struggled with their mental health, and particularly if they're living in supported accommodation and things like that, or they're on a mental health ward, they don't always have the biggest support around them. I'm not saying in all cases, but certainly in many cases. And when you're a worker and you care that deeply for that person, they have a legacy with you because they weren't just a resident. Not that anybody feels like that, but with respect, that they weren't just somebody that passes through. There's somebody that stains you. There's somebody that stays with you. So it says something really positive about you. And I think that anybody who works with somebody in that way and loses them, to kind of hold that memory is powerful. But the other side of it is that it then makes work feel a little bit less safe. So it doesn't matter how you've been prepped and you have been told that these things can happen and that they'll be difficult to manage, but that they are a potential. Nothing is as affronting as losing somebody in circumstances that you wish you could have changed or that you wish could have been prevented. So you have to deal with the trauma, and it's an impact and it's an origin trauma. If you haven't been through it before, then you're going to remember that because it's the most present and it's the most powerful because it's that impact. So I guess there are different things. First of all, like I said, take the real positive that you're a really great human being for caring deeply about the people that you work with. And then on top of that, remember that there's some trauma associated with it. It's coming up to the year anniversary, so then you have a trigger for that and you have an anchor to the moment. So revisiting is completely normal in those circumstances. But it's like anything with trauma, you have to register how impactful it is in your day-to-day life, because you have a right to feel this. When you were a professional working in the field, a lot of times you just feel that you haven't got a right to feel deeply moved or traumatized by something because you know it's work. But that's why you're in that profession, because you are the kind of person who cares. And because of that, there are these wounds and you carry them. And so, like I said, you have to explore the limit on that wound. Is it something that is interfering your day-to-day life and making you feel that when you go to work, you get triggered? Is it something that gives you nightmares? Is it something that's made you panic? And they're big questions to ask yourself, because like I said, you're not invincible and you are vulnerable to things like PTSD. Those are things that everybody in those fields has to contemplate potentially engaging with at some point in their life. So like I said, you need to ask yourself those bigger questions as well, because it could be that you need to speak to work and just have a conversation about getting some additional support without feeling like that is admitting any weakness. It isn't. It's completely rational. When we lose something really important to us, and particularly if it's been in quite tragic circumstances or very unexpected, then that also provokes higher levels of trauma. So just to put it out there, like I said, you're a great human being, but acknowledge your humanness in all of this. "Hi Emma, I've seen you on TV and I was hoping you might be able to help my son and me and his mum. I really don't know where to start with this, but here goes. Split with his mum when he was 3. It was my fault. I take that on the chin, and all he wants is us. With respect to anybody who splits in a relationship, you would still be in the relationship. It was one that was working. So as much as you might have chosen to leave, and you may have done that badly, you may have made choices that you ideally on reflection wish you hadn't made to leave the relationship, you weren't in that relationship because you were happy, and therefore ultimately, no matter how you did it, it was probably the right thing to do. And kicking yourself and blaming yourself for things that you cannot control because it's in the past is not going to be healthy, just to put that out there. He always is lying about everything. No matter what punishment, he just gets threatened. No matter what punishment he gets, he threatens suicide or that the world is against him. He was groomed online a few months ago, and despite the police saying stay away, us both making sure there was no contact, he still thinks this guy is not what we say and has contacted him. But this time he's introduced his disabled stepbrother to him, causing friction from their dad. Both me and his mum are worried that he's going to end up being a rapist or murderer. I know that sounds harsh, but it's true. Our son doesn't seem to accept normal. If there is anything you could advise. So you're catastrophizing, and it's completely normal. It's what parents do. When we have children, we want them to come out of the womb and immediately start reading. Ideally speak Chinese by the age of 6. Obviously be an athletic champion, but a good person as well, who wins, but wins in a graceful way. We then want them to succeed in every exam and probably study something like medicine, but not just leave it there. Go on to maybe take 3 different disciplines, become a world leader in neuroscience, just win the Nobel Peace Prize and live till at least 96, bearing their fruit and having generations of fabulously clever children who automatically go on to make the world an even better place. That's what every parent wants. And then you get your kids. And some people, very rarely, get that kind of example. And I mean, probably about as rarely as winning the Euro Millions, which I've entered for weeks since the beginning of it happening, as well as the lotto, and I think the biggest one I ever had was £100, and I'm still lucky, right? So arguably it's not easy to get that kind of dynamic going on. So when you have a child, those dreams and aspirations are all there, they're all in the back of your mind. It's the Western philosophy of what we can achieve in our world, that we have these offspring that just supersede anything and everything that we've been and make the world a better place, right? But when your child ends up not going in that dynamic and direction, then the questions begin, and you start getting angry and frustrated because, hey, you're great people. Okay, you had a breakdown of a relationship, but you're still great people. And it starts making you consider, well, there must be something endemically wrong with this child. The lies, the deceiving, the refusing to go down the path that we're choosing for them, and so on and so forth. And it's scary. So to any parent out there who's dealt with kids who lie or are super hedonistic, and you find loads of paraphernalia in the room and you're like, oh my God, my child's taking drugs, and it won't even matter if you did that in your past. You'll immediately be like, well, I did it in my past, but I was entirely sensible when I was doing hedonistic drugs. It's the way that human beings are. The do as I say, not as I do. Like, every young person lies. And I mean, I'm talking a lot. And we don't talk about that a lot because we all want to imagine that our relationship with our child is just the most pure and driven and there's never going to be a problem and our child tells us everything. And it's like, no, they don't. They really do not. And it's good for your mental health that they do not. Because young people, even really sensible, good young people, just do things that you don't need to know about, from the conversations that they have with peers through to the things that they text one another about boys they like or girls that they like, and so on and so forth. Because you're entering the inner circle of their psyche at a point where they don't have the responsibilities, they don't have the practicalities, they don't have the conscience, they don't have all of these things that you will learn as you grow older and then look back in horror at how you might have been when you were younger. For the most part, if we're all really honest with ourselves, not everybody, some people will be the neuroscientists that I talked about at the setup of this, but for the most part, if we're really honest with ourselves and we look back at who we were when we were teenagers, a lot of us can genuinely stand aghast at what we thought made sense, let alone what we created illusionarily wise in our lives to try to suggest to our parents that we were just really well behaved all the time. So the fact that your son isn't bothered about getting found out, that is an issue that is causing you concern. So he will lie, and when he gets found out, he's not really that bothered about it. So there are two issues there. One is the reason that he might not be that bothered about it is because essentially the consequences don't really impact on him in a way that makes him want to change. That's one level. The second level is it's symptomatic. He wants to create an issue so that you and your ex divert their attention off one another and project it onto him. That is what we see regularly in young people's behavioural issues, that they're basically so aware of the fractures and problems between the two adults that they create this behaviour so that they deflect and they concentrate on the child. And it brings that togetherness. Think about it. Whilst you and your ex are connecting over him, well, in his mind, maybe there'll be an opportunity for you to connect in a way where you're brought back together. And it might even be something so unconscious that he isn't even aware of it. So therefore, in his head, all he knows is that he's got this behaviour that brings you two together to talk about it, discuss it, get angry with him about it, but it connects you. And if he's really heartbroken about the fact that you're not together, then is it not better for him to have you together in that moment than not together at all? Is he fearful that if he changes and shifts that behaviour, then ultimately you won't communicate anymore and then he'll lose you for good? When we have fears of abandonment, when we've got attachment issues, it's incredibly powerful. And we create many behaviours to try to manage that. Ultimately, when they're young as well, even through teenagehood, finding how to differentiate between good attention and bad attention is really difficult. Our brain's just going through so many different changes of grey matter that essentially good behaviour and bad behaviour and the attacks that you receive or the obvious praise that you receive can be processed in a way where our brain is kind of confused. As long as it's attention, well, it's attention. And also when you get into a cycle of habitual behaviour like that, then that's how you learn to get your attention. So it's very confusing. The fact that he's connected with somebody online tells a story. And that story is that he feels like somebody's giving him a lot of attention. This is one of the major pitfalls when it comes down to predators and young people. They're not trying to get groomed. They're not looking at a way for a predator to molest them. That's not what anybody does, ever, in the history of being molested and abused. If you are spending time online with somebody and you are really, really engaged with them, and just because you can see as an adult that this person is not right and there is something deeply sinister about their actions, if the child is getting something that they do not feel that they are getting in real life, in physical life, then arguably, why will they feel that you taking it away from them is something they understand? Because if they're not actually experiencing it in the here and now, then they're getting it elsewhere, which is a really telling statement. What is it that needs to be brought to the here and now? That's not a blame thing, by the way. It's actually an acknowledgement. No child is spending time online with a potential predator because that predator is trying to be nasty. They are grooming them in a way that makes them feel special. What is it about that relationship that is allowing your son to feel special? What are the attributes that are being offered to him? What are the suggestions? What's the positivity? What's the praise? What are the keys that that predator is potentially using to try to unlock the relationship with your son? And then the bits that actually have credence, i.e., is it that this predator is using lots of praise and telling the person how special they are and reminding them that they'll be there for them no matter what? These are all classic toolkits in predators' toolboxes. And ironically, it's a lesson for parents when a child is spending copious amounts of time online having that kind of relationship with somebody. Because if at the root of it, excuse me, if at the root of it, the message is this: he makes me feel special, worthy, he makes me feel visible, he accepts me even though I'm imperfect, he doesn't constantly tell me that I'm not good enough, and he promises me that he will never ever leave me. Well, they are really powerful statements to take away and be like, right, this is what's missing, and this is what we can create, and this is what we can change in our behaviour to produce an impact on my child so that they no longer feel the need to have that kind of relationship and can also come to me to unpick what it was about that relationship that made it stand out. And the fact that he's introduced the stepbrother to this individual, well, of course, because this individual is going to be asking him to. So he's not actively going out of his way to probably introduce the stepbrother because he's thinking about it in a cogent manner. He's just thinking, hey, this guy says introduce an even more vulnerable person. And that's clearly what predators do. So you're great at the fact that you've noticed this, and it's really key that you end that relationship and you make sure that person doesn't have access to your child. But it's like, what are the key measurables there that stand out for your child? So I would really explore that as well. How do I deal with an alcoholic boyfriend? He's 28. We're separated, but we have 3 and 4-year-old. He says he cannot cope because of his mental health and won't stop drinking. So you said that you're separated, but you call him an alcoholic boyfriend. So I'm imagining there is still a real emotional connection and that you haven't ended it. You're just kind of having some distance and wanting him to sort himself out. And that must be very painful for you, because when we love somebody and they are destroying themselves to some degree, it's incredibly challenging. But also you've got kids. You have a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old, and your priority undoubtedly, unilaterally, without apology, needs to be on your children. Your 3 and 4-year-old are your key concerns. You being a parent and making sure that you look after your needs and really clearly look after your children's needs without any need to feel bad or guilty because you can't miraculously answer his is important. You know, you have to think about what your kids need, and they need you to be somebody who self-cares, self-preserves and protects the self, right? But that doesn't mean that it isn't really challenging for you, because clearly you're in love with him. And also I have a deep respect for anybody who is in relationship with somebody who's got dependency issues and hasn't just told them where the highway is permanently, because people don't choose dependency for fun. They really don't. And I'm not a believer in tough love. I'm really not. But I do think when you have children, you really have to think about your needs and their needs above everything else. And anything that's going to take from you is going to take from them, right? So you don't want to have somebody draining your resources, because that will drain the resources your children have on you and you'll be burnt out. That noted, as I've said, it's really important to make sure that people that we love who've got dependency issues realise that we still love them, but our love comes with key conditions. And some of those key conditions are that they have to do something constructive about the way that they self-medicate. So alcohol, without a doubt, is an anaesthetic for pain. It's the same when we look at stronger drugs like heroin, for example. Realistically, somebody is self-medicating their emotional problematic experience. And so it's impossible to just be like, right, just stop drinking now and everything's going to be all right. Firstly, if somebody is drinking heavily daily, it can actually be really dangerous for them to just stop alcohol. So that's number one. Number two, if they have deep emotional pain and they stop drinking, there needs to be some kind of strategy around how that gets managed. And number three, they definitely need somebody who's going to support them during that process, albeit that you might have to do that from separate addresses and not constantly be in their world because you have other priorities. So that's all obvious. What you really need, though, is some professional help. And for that, he has to absolutely acknowledge that he has an issue. And it's really scary when you're a dependent. Because if you say to somebody, yeah, I have alcoholism, I'm an individual suffering from alcoholism, I'm an alcoholic, and I need to stop drinking, and I'm going to do that, then you become accountable and responsible for that situation. And that's a big height to fall from. And it's also a commitment that you've kind of stated. So what happens a lot is that people will just be like, I just can't do it. I'm sorry, I'm in too much of emotional pain to deal with this. My mental distress will be too great, and so on and so forth. But it's just a way of limiting change and preventing growth. So I guess that as a partner, what can you do? Well, I think you have to be very clear that he cannot have real access to you and your children on a consistent basis unless he's sober. And whether you agree that there are going to be some boundaries around when he sees them in a supervised manner so that you can feel safe, or whether you decide that for a period of time he needs to kind of go away and get his head together and actually start thinking about what he'll lose, that's up to you. But he does need to take responsibility for the fact that he's an alcoholic, Because at the moment he does that, there are lots of things that can change, such as going to GP, speaking to them about the options that are available. Now, the options might be a tablet that means that every time he even goes near alcohol, he feels really, really sick. There's like an aversion therapy. Obviously, it's not for everybody, but certainly that can be helpful. It might be that you start encouraging him, shall I say, encouraging him. Either way, go to Alcoholics Anonymous and start doing visits on a regular basis so that he can spend time around other people who've been there. That's so helpful. And most importantly, when he starts getting that professional help and he realises it's not a failure, he's a dependent, they're two really separate things. Nobody's failing because they're an addict. They're just struggling really hard. So they're the things that I would suggest doing. But the big one for me is that he has to acknowledge it. Because if he's choosing alcohol over you and the children and he's not willing to make any changes, well, you need to think about self-preservation. It doesn't mean that you can't love him. It just means that you love him with understandable conditions. And until he meets those conditions, he can't be an active part and player in your world, because you deserve better. And more importantly than even you deserving better, you're teaching your kids what to expect in their life. And when they're older, do you want this for them? And if the answer's no, then that's a really good reinforcer of why you can't accept it either. So that's what I'd suggest. Just a very genuine conversation with him to say, these are our boundaries, this is the condition. When you're ready, I'm going to be here, but you have to take that first step in seeking some help. And I know it's hard at the moment because GPs aren't the easiest people to see, but nonetheless, he should try his best to get in front of somebody who can start making some changes for him medically and also oversee the reduction in his alcohol use. Hi, I'm a 25-year-old primary school teacher. I'm feeling burnt out at the moment. Stress levels are high with everything going on, plus COVID catch up. How do I cope with feeling like I'm failing or falling? I don't know which one that is. Falling. Well, so first of all, I mean, teachers have just been working all the way through. So acknowledge that you've been at the forefront of this since day one, like Tesco workers, care workers, etc., etc. You are individuals who really didn't have that much time where you could adjust to what was going on. So initially, when COVID hit, there was almost like this sense of an existential threat where potentially millions were going to die, and you even had the Prime Minister being like, well, somebody's going to die in your family. And so that was very much drilled in. And then you're in a situation where before that news even has an opportunity to sink in, and then the deathmometers are in the papers and there's all of this stuff online that's really terrifying. You're kind of having to prep and get everything sorted for online learning, which is a whole new world and it's a completely different experience. Look, I know young kids. Young kids were a big part of my career early on and are still something that I feel an absolute devotion to, as you will know. Hence why I've screamed from the top of my lungs about mental health, the mask impact and all the other things on children, as much as the COVID fascists would have it that I'm some kind of lunatic who just wants to go out and be like, just get the plague. You know, that's not true, is it? The truth is that I know the impact that measures had on children and young people. So I get it, and I get where you will have been. You will have been so concerned about your young learners. And as primary school, online, I mean, how impossible is that? Listen, I've worked in play therapy and group work with kids. I have watched attention spans and how they are. And the fact is, you've had probably 30 kids online at some point trying to get them to commit and connect to the work. And it's not their space. A lot of kids are kinesthetic learners. A lot of boys in particular at primary school need a lot of movement. So you know that some kids are going to have massively fell behind. And who does that come back on? It comes back on teachers. Nobody's going to be sat at home saying, oh, right, okay, well, it's the kids' fault. It's going to be when Ofsted come or when they look at results or when you're, head of years and your pastoral head and your head of your primary school looks at that. They're not going to be necessarily going, oh, well, the pastoral side, yeah, it makes sense because they've had all of these issues. They're still going to be looking at results, and that falls on teachers. So that's really tough. So part of this isn't that you're burning out because you're not able to cope emotionally. It's like you've had 2 years of traumatization, massive amounts of adaptation, a need to completely reorganize and restructure the way that you exist in your career. Then you had to return to work, still probably not very convinced about whether it was safe. Then you had to be covered up on masks and watch your kids struggle to some degree. And all the time you are like seeping in the emotional distress that a lot of the kids will have been feeling, and you care deeply. So compassion fatigue is massive. So when people talk about compassion fatigue, what we're talking about is burnout. So people who are really, really positive and passionate about their careers, it doesn't matter how fantastic and how wonderful you find them, if you have a really high compassion and empathy level, you kind of can't help but seep in all of the negatives, and you can't help but care deeply about all of the things that have gone wrong. And so therefore you walk around kind of constantly being hit by all of these different feelings and experiences of others, and you swallow it. And then you just feel totally lethargic, very depressed. You don't feel like you've got the energy to really get through the day on the whole. You lose interest in things that you enjoy, and you all but feel like there really isn't that much point. And one of the hardest bits is that something that you might have just absolutely loved doing just feels black and white, just doesn't feel full of that technicolor anymore. And I would imagine that's what you're talking about right now. I would imagine that's how you feel right now. So there are a number of things I would suggest. First of all, I don't ever think it's bad if you're really struggling to take some time out. I know like nobody wants to talk about that because it's like, oh my God, my employer won't be happy if I take some time out. It's like, I don't care about your employer, I care about you, and you need to care about you. People will bleed you dry at work, they always will. There are literally no awards whatsoever for being in 24/7, we all know that. It's just, we build a bias where we're like, well, my boss will notice if I just work 365 days a year, but you don't have to. So you need to do some self-regulation and self-checking. How do you feel? Do you feel really like, ultimately I'm gonna burst into tears, I don't want to get up in the morning, I'm starting to hate my workplace? If you feel any of those things, go in and see your GP, or speaking to them on Zoom, or having a phone call. I don't know how it works, mine just operates by phone now. But just saying, I am really struggling, I feel like I'm burnt out, I need some time and space, and they give you 2 weeks to just take some time out, it would be good to just then check out how you feel. And it's like, well, what can I do in that 2 weeks of self-care? I can offer myself the opportunity to just reflect on how I'm genuinely feeling and when it began and where I am now, and how I can track back whether there were some ultimate triggers, such as going through COVID or going back to school in the workplace when you were scared, or the masks, or whatever it is, and kind of work that through. And then if that's not going to be something that you find reasonable, as in I don't want to be off school, I've got too much on already, then maybe bring it back down to, okay, so first off, it's not your job to make catch up for the government's handling of what happened. And you have to kind of build that into your psyche. So you have to be able to neutralize that fear and anxiety. And the way that you've got to do that is to reframe. It's not about saying, oh, well, I don't have any responsibility. Look, you've got the responsibility you take. You want your kids to do well, but you can't wave a magic wand and get rid of COVID and what happened. So instead, you have to ultimately make clear the objectives that you can achieve. And that's doing some really, really obvious strategy around what expectations you really feel that you have to achieve, because you can't be where you were 2 years ago. You can't expect to get the same stats that you might have got years ago. You've got to do that reframing. And I guess that part of that is sharing with your other teachers, because there will be other teachers in the same situation feeling the same way with the same fears. Like, how can you work together? Because when you work together, you have so much more power. When you sit down together in the staff room and you say, well, this is what I'm struggling with. What are you struggling with? These are the issues that I'm facing. What are you facing? You can kind of recognize that ultimately you're not alone. And that's such a powerful feeling, to not feel alone. And then from there, look at your union. The one thing I would say about teachers, they have really strong unions. Your unions will know that there are lots of teachers feeling like you do right now. So if you've got a rep and you struggle, have a conversation with them and let them help you figure out some ways forward where you don't have the pressure and you do feel that there's some positivity. Because if you can do that, you will feel like you're in control. And the truth is, one of the big feelings that I think teachers will have had in the last few years is just feeling ultimately completely out of control. And know that there's a sympathy and an empathy for you out there. But like I said, some of this might just be about you needing some time and space to just process. And ask yourself this question: did I love my job before COVID? And if you did, then it's going to be okay in the long term anyway, because it's going to all be okay. We're always going to get there in the end. And like it says, the saying goes, everything will be okay in the end, and if it isn't okay, it isn't the end, and it won't be. So know that the way you used to feel about teaching is where you need to get back to. Ultimately, of course, if before the pandemic you were kind of having misgivings, well, then this would be a point to check in about where you are and how you feel about the general experience of your occupation. But the big thing as well, just know that a lot of us parents have a deep sympathy and also a newfound respect for teachers. Genuinely. I mean, I think a lot of us kind of acknowledge that it must be difficult to teach kids per se. It's still a miracle as far as I'm concerned that children learn to read so quickly at primary school. So we have a respect, but I don't think we ever respected it in the way that we probably do now, having to teach our kids at home and realising how useless we are at it. I mean, my kids genuinely were 2 years behind when they went back to school. Well, one didn't go back to school and one finished college, so I guess he didn't either. And neither of them learned very much, because it turns out I'm useless at home education and actually kind of absolved responsibility for it. So just know that there's a whole heap of respect out there for teachers per se. The next two are similar, so I guess these are going to be kind of together. Hi Emma, my 14-year-old has suffered anxiety ever since starting school. But since starting secondary school, it's just turned into a monster. Every single morning she feels sick to her stomach, crying panic attacks. I'm finding it so draining. I just want her to be happy and I have no idea of what to do. A lot of her anxiety seems to be health and being trapped in school feeling unwell. Any advice would be so appreciated. Listen, another one is, hi Emma, how can I help my 10-year-old daughter with anxiety? So both those. So first of all, your daughter is suffering from a very high level of anxiety there. So when you think about generalized anxiety disorder, that feels like that probably meets that bar. And you said about health, well, a lot of children are really feeling hyper connected to health, because we've had the last few years literally suggesting that people that they love are going to be killed by them. You know how I feel about it, guys. Reprehensible, fully unnecessary, and a diabolical blight on our history and stain on our history as far as I'm concerned. But this is where we are. And ultimately our babes are dealing with the pain. So high school, it's a terrifying change for a huge amount of kids. So don't think that your child has in any way, shape or form got anything seriously amiss with the fact that the change and transition to high school has become really upsetting, because it's massive. It's absolutely massive. You go from these primary experiences, which on the whole, even kids who don't particularly like primary school, it's still quite a nice experience. The teachers are the same and they kind of get to do a lot more activities that are fun, and usually there's less stress as far as the organisation, needing to go to different classrooms, eating at a certain time frame, being really super well behaved, and all of the things that high school creates versus primary school. So there is a massive transition. Add to that if you've got a temperament that's sensitive, and a lot of children are born with a DNA that is more sensitive. So you're always going to be fighting the battle a little bit regarding new experiences. And then that was before, like I said, there was this huge volume on death and scary spaces. So any child who's gone back to school or has transitioned to a high school and they're feeling anxious, well, that's actually something that they've been taught. And it doesn't matter what amazing homes you created for them, or in the past that they have been able to be all right and get on with things. That was before the government and the nudge unit and the press literally rocket fueled their panic, anxiety and fear and sent it to a whole new universe that none of us, at least in this generation, have ever had to contend with. Even when you think about the war, back in the days where we had refugees and kids shipped off to different places away from their parents because they were in cities, and we had wars that genuinely involved things like bombing, to the degree here, we had also this limited news. So again, it was happening, but people weren't constantly having it rammed down the throats. It was like something they saw and experienced, but it wasn't a constant, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. This has been the biggest transition, I think, from what was known as safe to unsafe in lots of generations with respect in the UK. So your kids aren't going to be functioning how they used to function because they're not who they used to be. And it's difficult because we want them to be who they used to be, but they can't be. My youngest son is certainly not who he used to be. God, I wish he was. But then somebody came and, totally changed the society. So I think you need to take a breath as a parent, both of you, and be like, okay, so that makes sense. It makes sense that my kid is really struggling. Okay, some kids aren't, and that's fine, because you can kind of see them going to school and they seem to be getting on with it. That doesn't mean that the undercurrents are not screaming. It doesn't mean that they're not going home at night and are full of chaos. It's just that your child feels safe enough to some degree to express it. And believe me, there are many, many children out there who feel hyper anxious, who have panic attacks in toilets, who are violently sick in the dinner hour, and literally feel completely broken by what's occurred, but are terrified of going home and expressing that because their parents aren't very nice to them, or they're so neglected that no one really cares. You have a child who feels so confident that you love them that they're able to express this to you. So that's good. Number 2, with the one who's at high school, I think that it would be really worth speaking to a GP just to kind of get on the waiting list for CAMHS, because what you're getting to here is a place and a point where, unless she has a place to decompress, there's a chance that she might be like, I just don't want to go to school anymore. Because that's what she's trying to do. She's going to try to prevent her having to leave the house. Her house is a safe place. Remember, we kept them in for a long period of time and said they could do anything from home and everything from home. And she's decided to vote with her feet to some degree because she preferred it. Home's safe, mum's safe, life's safe, and I can do everything on my computer. So I'd rather do that. And to some degree, when you had an existential apparent threat out there, whether it was true or otherwise, for her, it's been true. So now she's figured out that she felt safer at home, and why should she go to school? So you have to help her understand that the feelings that she has are entirely rational. They're based on an experience that she was told was going to be terrifying, but they've outgrown their purpose. We've got new information. The world isn't dangerous in the way that she believed. There is risk, but there always will be. And actually, together, if you agree, you can work out some kind of model of, shall we say, agreement with the school where she feels that there are safer options there, such as, I would definitely speak to the school about having a card, which means that she can leave class if she's struggling. Maybe she's going to panic, maybe she needs a toilet, maybe she's afraid of being sick because she feels all these physical feelings. So give them an opportunity to help her have that pastoral support where she can literally just be like, I'm going to go out of the room, and the teacher doesn't challenge her. That can be really, really helpful. Secondly, is there a quiet space and a place that she can go at school where she actually feels that people understand that when she's in that space and place, she's just taking some time out. It makes her feel like ultimately she's not alone, and actually people are listening, because at the moment she's got all of these physical feelings and they're not serving a purpose. She's still going to school and feeling terrible, which is then reinforcing the fact that she doesn't want to go to school. So something needs to change for her to ultimately feel that the school is going to be an easier place to inhabit. At the moment, it seems like she's getting more and more unhappy and more distressed. And if that carries on, then you're going to ultimately have her refusing to go up, because school refusers grow in that regard. Again, it might be that you speak to school about having opportunities for her to have maybe one day at home and the rest of the week at school. There are lots of things that you can do around arguing with and negotiating with the school based on whatever your child needs. Also, I'm always going to say, if you can get to teach her some little strategies, so diaphragmatic breathing, any kind of meditation, things that just help her to feel relaxed, get her to do some anchoring, psychological anchoring. There'll be free streams online. I think I've got one on my YouTube, Wellbeing, but it's where you teach them to kind of smell something really nice whilst they're visualizing something really positive, and you get them to just take that scent into school, whatever can just help her to anchor those feelings. But the other thing that you can also do is get her to work out what her worst case scenarios are. A lot of people don't really do that with their kids because they're afraid of what they're going to say, but it's really helpful. Like the worst case scenario, because there's always like a fundamental fear. And for both of the children in this situation, some of the fundamental fears might be that, they might die, you might die, something at school might go horribly wrong, they all might catch something awful, and you've kind of got to allow them to express that, and you've got to create realistic connections with what's fundamentally going to happen as opposed to what their fears amplify as might potentially happen. So I would do all of those things. But just to say to any parent, remember, your kid's not the kid they were. And there's a real grief process associated with that. And the more as well that you get hold of this anxiety now, the better, because we want to teach our children that ultimately anxiety is there to help protect you. But if it amplifies to a degree where it's doing the opposite, then they need to understand that it's lost its purpose, it's lost its sense of place in your world. It's no longer protective, it's attacking you, and it's destroying the very sense of security that you wanted to create by limiting your feelings and limiting the opportunities you have to enjoy the world. And obviously check out the other things such as bullying, not connecting with peers, not having some good alliances there, because that can be really problematic as well. But they're the things that I do. Hi Emma, I opened up about my sexual abuse to my mum. She doesn't want to believe it happened to me. How can I get my mum to believe she stopped speaking to me and I'm falling apart? It's not your job to get your mum to believe your truth. And if you do that, if that is your main priority at this moment, where you've done an incredibly courageous thing, where you've spoken that truth, and then you feel that unless that person validates that truth, then sometimes it doesn't have the worth, well, then it's a redundant experience. We tell people our truth not for their validation. We tell them so they understand. The fact that she isn't able to manage this, well, look, first of all, I'll give your mum a sense of, shall we say, best case scenario with her feelings, which is she's been told this piece of information. It's completely overwhelmed her. She feels like she's failed. She doesn't want to believe it. It's easier to imagine that you're a massive liar and a fantasist than to know that her baby got horribly molested. And honestly, so many parents do that. And a lot of people are like, well, what terrible human beings that they just didn't immediately envelop this person in their arms and say, I believe you. Like, that is what we're meant to do. And to anybody listening, if you ever have somebody come up to you and tell you they've been sexually molested, that's my advice. Wrap them, as long as they're happy with that, in your arms and say, I fully believe you, how can I support you? That's the A-star grade, yeah? But it's a bit like when I've worked with people who've come out to parents and the reaction has been like lukewarm to really, really cold. And that person feels totally broken by this reaction. And on one level, I can be like, yeah, not okay really that they acted that way. That's not helpful, because that's not going to help cement the relationship in the long term. So it's far better for me to be, this is something that we aim to do, where we immediately celebrate a person being open and honest about who they are, and we accept them fully. That's the A grade, the A-star grade. But if they fail to do that, we don't go, oh, well, what a terribly homophobic person your parent is. Actually, it can just be that the parent is struggling to re-identify with the person that they thought they were bringing up sexually in a certain way. And then suddenly they realize that actually the sexual orientation of the child that they thought was a certain orientation is no longer that way. And they don't know how to kind of conceive that and deal with it. And over a few days, they get used to it. And they're like, fine. And that's true. That's for the most part. So it could be, on the best case scenario, your mum is like, this was a sexual abuse. She's just struggling, deflecting it away, avoiding it, and making you out to be the problem, and hoping that you'll come back and be like, I'm really sorry. I made this all up, which of course you're never going to do. So let's give her the benefit of the doubt and say that she's dealing with that. What do you need to do? Well, first of all, just give it time, because nothing changes the courage that you showed. I'm really glad that you had that conversation. I'm really proud of you speaking those words and taking that risk with your feelings, which is what we do in those circumstances. You were abused. That's it. There is nothing that is going to change that horrible reality, and you've had to survive that. And now you're confiding in the people that you need to confide in, and that's a brave thing to do. And some will absolutely respond exactly as you wish to, and some will fall short, and some will just fall so far down that you'll not be able to sure whether you'll ever see them again. But the truth is, it doesn't change the fact that you have taken that risk, because you are acknowledging and accepting that this happened to you, you didn't deserve it, and you're not going to be a prisoner. You're not going to be a victim. You're going to survive this. And you'll find allies, and sometimes we'll find enemies on that route. Your mum at the moment is rejecting you because she cannot manage it. She can't deal with the overwhelming shift of paradigm that she has to perceive her parenting as, that she has to see in her child. She doesn't want to acknowledge it, she doesn't want to believe it, she doesn't want to see it, she doesn't want to talk about it, and that's not great. She's fallen short of our expectations, but you have to leave the door open. You don't need to run after her and push the door open and be like, Mom, come through it. That's not your job. You don't need to change anything about you. You don't need to explain yourself to her. You don't need to validate why it was true and give her reasons and circumstances. You don't need to do any of those things. That is not for you to do. You don't owe her that. And certainly she doesn't deserve you to just literally feel like you have to put everything down and confirm everything, give her times and dates and reasons and explanations so that suddenly she believes you. You are believed because you know it happened, and the many people around you who will completely understand that and accept that and make sure that you feel that reflected. So right now it's like, take a breath. You've told your mum. She's doing her thing, but you did what was right. And if you chase after her and try to make her see, that will, as far as she's concerned, be something that you're trying to push when she isn't ready to have it pushed at her. And that could make her even further dig her heels in, because she's now convinced that you're kind of trying to do some kind of reputation management with her by evidencing A, B, and C that she's not ready to hear. Just pull it back to, you've done the right thing, you've told her, she's fallen short, give her some space and time, but do not feel that you owe her any more than what you have done. Now it's her job to do the work, because you're the victim here. You've already had something dreadful happen to you, and you've taken great strength in showing her and inviting her into the gift which is your truth. The fact that she hasn't been somebody who's been gracious enough to take that at this moment in time, like I said, give her the benefit of the doubt for now. Let her process it and let her be, because she needs time to really go through that and to realize that you're not going to chase her because you've done nothing wrong. You don't owe her an apology. You've given her a real insight. Let's see whether she creates a value into that insight and comes back to you. But let's just give it a little bit of time. I'll be here again next week, so we can always process that again if things haven't changed in a week. But just know that you're enough. You did an amazing thing. You're incredibly brave. And this is how you go from victim to survivor. You stop being ashamed of the truth and you start speaking it. Right, guys, I will see you again next week. If you're on Wednesday, I will be covering a crime on my True Crime channel on YouTube, and I'll see you there. But otherwise, sorry for the interference. Dusted has managed to pick himself up off the floor now and is breathing at a normal rate after having some kind of breakdown earlier on in the evening. Take care. And my puppy is asleep now. Back to front. You'll all be happy to know. Not a euphemism either. Really is a puppy that I'm stroking. Take care, darlings.